Crystal chandeliers shimmered above as laughter rippled across the banquet hall. Richard Vaughn's voice sliced through the air like a whip.
$2,000 ruined because of a clumsy waitress who can't tell her left hand from her right.
Guests smirked behind polished glasses, their eyes flicking toward Amelia Carter, frozen with the empty bottle in her trembling hand. She bowed her head, lips pressed tight. But when she finally looked up, her gaze was steady, almost burning.
I'll replace what can be replaced, sir,
She said softly. The room stilled. Something in her tone cracked the air. Vaughn blinked, suddenly unsure. Silence dropped heavy. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above as laughter rippled across the banquet hall. Richard Vaughn's voice sliced through the air like a whip. $2,000 ruined because of a clumsy waitress who can't tell her left hand from her right. Guests smirked behind polished glasses, their eyes flicking toward Amelia Carter, frozen with the empty bottle in her trembling hand. She bowed her head, lips pressed tight, but when she finally looked up, her gaze was steady, almost burning. "I'll replace what can be replaced, sir," she said softly. The room stilled. Something in her tone cracked the air. Vaughn blinked, suddenly unsure. Silence dropped heavy. That silence carried her back. A soundless rush of memory unfolded behind her eyes, not of chandeliers or Bordeaux, but of early mornings in a cramped apartment in Queens. The air always smelled faintly of starch and detergent because her mother ironed other people's shirts before sunrise. Amelia, then just a girl, would sit on the edge of the bed and trace words from library books while Sarah, her younger sister, leaned against her shoulder. Their mother used to whisper a single line whenever Amelia faltered at a long word. Dignity isn't optional. Respect is the real currency. It wasn't a sermon, not a lecture, just survival wisdom wrapped in a phrase that clung to Amelia like a second skin. Years later, when her mother was gone and it was Amelia who scrubbed dishes, who balanced night classes with shifts at hotel ballrooms, that line became less a memory and more a shield. Now the banquet hall shimmered with wealth, but beneath the glitter was a battlefield she knew too well. Vaughn walked like a monarch among courtiers, his tailored suit absorbing every gaze, every nod of deference. To the investors gathered tonight, he was a living embodiment of success, the American dream polished to a ruthless shine. To Amelia, carrying trays of crystal glasses, he was something simpler, a test. She had seen his type since her first day working in these gilded rooms, men who measured human worth by the cut of a jacket or the label on a wristwatch. They believed waitstaff were furniture, useful only until they broke. As she moved between tables, Amelia caught snippets of Vaughn's voice booming over the string quartet. "Business is war," he declared, raising his glass, "and weakness is annihilation." Laughter followed, but not all of it was free. Some of the younger executives smiled too quickly. Some wives glanced at the floor. Vaughn's dominance was a tide everyone pretended to enjoy, even as it dragged them under. Amelia's steps were careful, her posture straight, her face unreadable. Yet inside, a storm built slowly. Every dismissive glance, every murmured joke about the help, pressed against her chest like stones. Still, she endured, not with passivity, but with discipline. Her discipline was not the kind found in management books, but the kind carved from hardship. Waking before dawn, studying contracts by the glow of a street lamp outside her window, keeping her voice calm even when her heart thundered. She reminded herself that success was not about screaming for recognition. It was about timing, about the moment when silence became more powerful than speech. The investors clinked glasses. Vaughn basked in their approval, throwing casual barbs toward staff that earned him cheap laughs. Amelia poured wine as though deaf to it, her eyes never flicking away from her task. But those who looked closely, those few who still believed in the weight of dignity, sensed something unusual. Her calm was not submission, it was poise, deliberate and unyielding, like a bow drawn back, waiting. And yet, beneath the stillness lay a question clawing at the edges of every glance. How much longer could she endure? Could discipline alone protect her against a man whose empire thrived on humiliation? Could her quiet strength outlast the roaring spectacle of his power? The chandelier light flickered, and Amelia's shadow stretched across the marble floor, tall, steady, unbroken. The silence that followed her words lingered for only a heartbeat before the tide of conversation surged again, washing away the moment as if it had never happened. Richard Vaughn smirked, his teeth flashing like a blade under the chandelier light, and turned his attention back to his circle of admirers. They leaned closer, eager to bask in his confidence, laughing at his sharp remarks, nodding at his every declaration about dominance and profit. Amelia slipped back into the current of her work, collecting empty glasses, laying fresh silverware, ensuring that each gesture was executed with a precision that concealed the tremor still alive in her chest. Yet, though the crowd resumed its merriment, a camera lens from across the room had already captured the spark in her eyes and the cruel curl of Vaughn's mouth. It would not stay confined to that gilded hall. Hours earlier, as Amelia prepared for this event in the narrow employee quarters, she had tied her apron with practiced hands, her mind echoing with the instructions drilled into her since the beginning of her career. Serve, do not speak, do not interfere. The uniform fit her body like armor, stiff white collar pressed against her throat, shoes polished to a dull shine. She knew she would be invisible tonight, or so they thought. But invisibility was its own kind of power. It gave her access to whispers, to the unfiltered arrogance of those who believed no one beneath them was listening. Amelia had learned to listen. She had learned to remember. When Vaughn entered the ballroom earlier that evening, his presence had shifted the atmosphere like a storm rolling in. He carried himself with the ease of a man convinced the world was built for him. Amelia, carrying a tray of delicate wine glasses, felt the collective pivot of attention toward him, the subtle bow of deference from men in suits worth more than most families' yearly income. His words had carried across the room even then, pronouncing that in business there was no mercy, only conquest. She had wondered, not for the first time, how many people in this room truly admired him and how many simply endured him out of fear of being crushed. Now, as he moved through the hall to secure a deal worth billions, Amelia's presence seemed more like background noise, yet her silence carried weight. She steadied her steps as she approached his table once more, her hand firm, even when his laughter threatened to pull her back to the memory of humiliation. She had endured countless evenings like this, where discipline was her anchor, where the insult was met not with retort, but with the kind of composure that unsettled those who expected collapse. She noticed the way a younger executive glanced at her, his brow creasing as if recognizing that her restraint was not weakness. A woman at the next table, her diamond earrings trembling under the light, seemed to study Amelia longer than necessary before lowering her eyes quickly as though she had glimpsed something dangerous. These small flickers of doubt among the crowd whispered a truth Vaughn could not control. Not everyone was blind to the dignity she carried. The evening unfolded with Vaughn at its center. He rose for a toast, his voice booming with conviction as he declared that success belonged to those willing to draw blood in the market. Applause rang out, yet Amelia heard the hesitation in some hands, the scattered claps that did not quite match the fervor Vaughn demanded. Her own hands remained steady as she placed a fresh glass beside him, ignoring the casual sweep of his arm that nearly knocked into her. He did not apologize. He never would. But elsewhere in the hall, a phone captured the earlier moment when his contempt met her calm defiance. The clip spread quietly from one device to another, leaving the ballroom in digital echoes even before the night ended. Amelia did not know this yet, but her silence had already begun to reverberate. As the night deepened, Vaughn grew bolder. He leaned back in his chair, speaking loudly enough for every nearby table to hear. He described acquisitions as if they were battlefield victories, companies as casualties to be stripped and discarded. He mocked former partners who had failed to keep pace, his laughter thick with scorn. Amelia moved around him like a shadow, her every step a study in poise. She placed plates, refilled glasses, cleared empty trays, all while her ears absorbed every cruel syllable. She never interrupted, never faltered, but inside, she was recording, engraving the moment into memory, as surely as if she had carved it into stone. When his hand shot out to seize her wrist during a pause in his monologue, the ballroom's chatter dipped again. His grip was not violent, but commanding, the gesture of a man accustomed to ownership. "Stand still," he said, his tone dripping with superiority. "That's what a servant should know. Patience." His audience chuckled, uncomfortable yet unwilling to confront him. Amelia's pulse quickened, but she did not pull away. She let the silence speak for her, her eyes locking with his for a fraction too long. Something flickered in him, though he disguised it quickly with another laugh and released her. The hall exhaled, conversation resuming, though the moment lingered like a shadow. Amelia's arm tingled from where he had held her, but she moved forward as though nothing had happened. She had learned long ago that discipline was not the absence of anger, but the mastery of it. Her strength lay not in reacting, but in enduring, until the exact moment endurance became weapon. At the head table, Vaughn unfurled his strategy for the $3.5 billion deal he was about to finalize. Investors leaned in, intoxicated by numbers, dazzled by the prospect of wealth expanding. Amelia could see it in their faces, the hunger that blinded them to the cruelty in his tone, the way he belittled entire workforces as mere numbers to be cut. She continued her rounds, invisible, yet aware, her mind tightening around the thought that these men were making decisions that would ripple into lives like hers, into families who would never see the inside of a ballroom like this. Through the mirrored walls of the banquet hall, Amelia caught her own reflection. Apron tied tight, hair pulled back, posture straight, eyes unflinching. She did not see a servant. She saw someone waiting for her moment, someone carrying years of lessons in silence, someone who could no longer be dismissed once the truth came into focus. She remembered Sarah's words whispered across their shared pillow late at night. "You don't need to shout to be heard, just stand tall." The deal neared its close. Vaughn's voice rose above the fading music, triumphant, declaring the inevitable. He basked in his supremacy unchallenged, or so he thought. Amelia placed the last tray upon the side table, her hand steady despite the pounding of her heart. The humiliation of spilled wine, the sting of his grip, the weight of every dismissive glance, each piece of it pressed into her bones, not as defeat, but as fuel. The investors might have looked through her tonight, but the world beyond this gilded hall would not. And in the hush that followed Vaughn's pronouncement of victory, a question lingered unspoken in the air. Could one woman's silence unravel the fortress of a man who had built his empire on arrogance? Amelia stood in the corner of the hall, her shadow stretching long across the marble, the faint hum of cameras still recording, the memory of her mother's words echoing like a vow. Respect was the real currency, and the balance was shifting, even if no one in the hall realized it yet. The ballroom did not sleep after the deal was sealed. Champagne corks cracked open with the same violence as Vaughn's laughter, spraying foam across the polished tablecloths while investors toasted his brilliance. Waiters hurried to refill flutes, their movements frantic under the watchful eye of the maitre d'. Amelia remained a constant presence in the background, each step measured, her face a mask of composure. Yet the more Richard Vaughn basked in his victory, the more she felt the weight of the room shifting, as though the marble floors themselves knew that triumph born of humiliation could never last. Her wrist still carried the ghost of his grip, faint but undeniable. She had not looked down at it all night, but she could feel it pulsing like a bruise beneath the skin. When he leaned back in his chair and recounted how he had turned competitors into rubble, how he had tricked a former partner into signing away patents by dangling the illusion of friendship, a few of the guests clapped too slowly, their smiles fixed but brittle. Vaughn did not notice. He believed fear was respect and laughter was loyalty. Amelia, circling behind him with a tray of untouched desserts, knew otherwise. She moved toward a corner where two junior analysts whispered in urgent tones. They spoke not of victory but of discomfort, their voices pitched low so as not to attract attention. "He grabbed her like she was property," one murmured, his eyes flicking toward Amelia as if he could not erase the sight. "I've seen him crush competitors, but this was different." The other shook her head quickly, silencing him with a glance toward the table where Vaughn's lieutenants sat. Amelia set down her tray near them without a word, her presence breaking their conversation. But she caught enough to confirm what she suspected. Not everyone was blind. Doubt had entered the hall. By now, the hidden camera footage had already slipped beyond these walls, moving from phone to phone, escaping into the restless appetite of the world outside. Someone at the far end of the room, a young guest too naive to fear Vaughn's wrath, had uploaded it within minutes. Amelia did not know this yet, but she sensed the shift. The waitstaff exchanged glances. The air tightened. The laughter began to feel rehearsed. Vaughn, of course, mistook the unease for awe. He rose to give another speech, his glass lifted high, his words swollen with arrogance. "We shape markets," he declared, his voice echoing against the chandeliers. "We dictate value, and those who cannot keep up are erased." His tone was sharp, almost gleeful, as though destruction itself were a prize. He gestured broadly, his hand nearly knocking into Amelia again as she passed. He did not look at her. To him, she did not exist beyond utility. The deal documents were carried into a side chamber for final signatures. Vaughn strode ahead with his entourage, leaving the ballroom in a temporary lull. Guests began to murmur, some slipping away to check phones, others refreshing their drinks. Amelia retreated to the kitchen for a moment of stillness, leaning against the cool stainless steel counter. Her chest rose and fell with controlled breaths. She reminded herself of Sarah's words, the memory of their mother's quiet dignity, the promise that silence could be stronger than fury. She had endured, but endurance was never the end, it was preparation. When she stepped back into the hall, she noticed eyes turning toward her more than before. Not accusatory, not mocking. Curious. A few people who had witnessed Vaughn's cruelty seemed to study her as if expecting her to break, but she did not. She walked with trays balanced steady, her back unbowed, her gaze calm. Her composure unsettled them more than tears ever could. In the private chamber, Vaughn scrawled his signature across the final page of the $3.5 billion contract. He slapped the pen down with the finality of a man who believed himself untouchable. Cameras flashed, documenting his victory. Outside the chamber doors, Amelia continued her rounds, the muffled echoes of celebration pounding like distant drums. She knew that this was his peak, the high point from which the fall must come. The fall began with whispers. A pair of investors slipped out of the chamber, their phones glowing faintly in the dark hallway. They looked at each other, brows furrowed, then back at their screens where the clip of Vaughn gripping Amelia's wrist and sneering had already surfaced. The world beyond these walls had begun to judge, and the verdict would not be kind. Back in the ballroom, Vaughn returned, triumphant, basking in cheers. But as he raised his glass again, his phone buzzed against the table. He glanced at it, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second before he forced it back into place. Amelia, collecting empty plates nearby, saw the flicker of unease. It was small, but it was there, the first crack in his armor. More buzzes followed, more furtive glances among the guests. Someone stifled a gasp at the far end of the room, their eyes wide as they stared at a glowing screen. Vaughn's voice grew louder, desperate to drown out the murmurs rising like a tide. "We are the victors," he shouted, but the rhythm of the room no longer matched his cadence. Amelia moved silently among the tables, the center of gravity shifting without her lifting a finger. She did not know yet what the clip contained, but she could feel its weight pressing into the room. It was no longer just humiliation in private, it had become proof that his cruelty was not a myth whispered among employees, but a spectacle documented and shared. Vaughn's empire thrived on fear, but fear was crumbling under the gaze of truth. At one table, a woman in pearls whispered to her husband, "He can't survive this." The man shook his head, eyes still fixed on his phone. "The stock will bleed by morning." Amelia carried away their empty glasses, her face serene, but her heart beat with a rhythm that felt like vindication. The banquet continued, outwardly. Champagne still poured, music still played, but the undercurrent had changed. Vaughn grew restless, pacing from table to table, forcing laughter, his eyes darting to the phones that no longer celebrated him, but dissected him. Amelia's silence cut sharper now, her calm presence a contrast to his unraveling. As the night drew deeper, she remembered again Sarah's voice, steady and insistent. "You don't need to raise your voice. Just stand tall." Amelia did not need to act. Not yet. The weight of Vaughn's collapse was already gathering momentum. His arrogance had fed the storm, and now the storm would turn on him. And in that hall, with chandeliers glittering above and glasses clinking in forced celebration, Amelia stood with her tray balanced and her posture straight, knowing without doubt that the question was no longer whether he would fall. The question was how soon the world would see it happen. The first sign that the night was breaking apart came not from Vaughn's voice, but from the silence that met it. He had risen once more to declare his dominance, to remind the hall that his name would be etched into the ledgers of history, but applause did not follow as it had earlier. A handful of claps echoed thinly, hesitant and scattered, then faded. Investors who had once leaned forward to catch his every word now leaned back, eyes lowered to the glow of their phones. Amelia noticed it before he did, a ripple of unease that passed through the room like a draft beneath a locked door. The clip was spreading faster than even the boldest rumor. Faces she recognized as stoic and unreadable now twitched with suppressed alarm, fingers tightening around glasses, brows knitting at the screens in their palms. Vaughn's smile faltered just slightly, as if his reflection in their eyes no longer matched the image he had built of himself. He tried to recover, cracking another joke about weakness in the marketplace, but the laughter sounded brittle, forced. Amelia kept moving, the tray balanced perfectly against her hip, yet she felt the weight of the room tilting, pulling toward her without anyone daring to name it. She remembered the grip on her wrist, the humiliation he had inflicted, and though she did not allow triumph to flicker across her face, she held herself straighter, knowing that her silence had become a mirror in which his arrogance was finally visible to all. The maitre d', usually composed, hurried past with clipped steps, whispering into his earpiece. Amelia caught fragments of his words: public relations, trending, catastrophic. Vaughn snapped his fingers to summon another glass of champagne, but when the waiter hesitated for a fraction too long, the illusion cracked further. He was no longer a king commanding a court. He was a man beginning to drown, his empire tugged under by currents he could not control. At a table near the back, an older investor cleared his throat loudly. "Perhaps we should review the terms of tonight's agreement," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. Heads turned toward him, then toward Vaughn, whose jaw tightened. "The contract is signed," Vaughn barked, but his words did not land with the same authority. "Nothing changes." The investor nodded slowly as if humoring a child and turned back to his phone. That gesture, so small, sliced deeper than any public denunciation. Vaughn's control was slipping, not because anyone shouted him down, but because no one feared him anymore. Benjamin Carter rose quietly from his seat near the center of the hall. Until now, he had remained a shadow at the edge of the evening, his presence acknowledged but not emphasized. He had watched his daughter endure humiliation with a calm that betrayed nothing, had waited for the moment when silence would give way to revelation. Now he stepped forward, his hands steady on the tablecloth as though marking the place of what was about to unfold. "Ladies and gentlemen," Benjamin said, his voice carrying across the ballroom with measured clarity. The conversations stilled. Vaughn turned, his expression tight, his glass half raised. "Allow me to introduce someone whose name has been absent from your discussions tonight, though her presence has been constant. This is Amelia Carter, my daughter." For a moment there was no sound at all, only the faint clink of ice in a glass. Amelia felt the room shift, every eye now fixed on her, no longer with contempt, but with dawning recognition. The waitress who had endured sneers and commands was not merely a servant in their midst. She was the daughter of one of the most respected financiers in the room, a man whose voice could move markets with a single recommendation. Vaughn's smirk collapsed into disbelief. He opened his mouth, but no words came, only the faint rasp of breath as he grasped for control. "Your daughter?" he managed finally, his tone disbelieving, almost mocking. But Benjamin did not falter. "Yes," he said simply, his gaze steady. "And tonight she has shown more composure, more discipline, and more leadership than you have displayed in your entire career." The words cracked the hall open. Investors who had once nodded at Vaughn now shifted their chairs toward Benjamin, their expressions brightening as if they had been waiting for permission to turn away. Phones buzzed with fresh updates. The clip had now reached news outlets, the headline blazing across screens: "Billionaire humiliates employee at gala." Amelia stood rooted, her heart pounding, but she did not shrink from their stares. Instead, she inhaled deeply, her shoulders squaring, as though she had been preparing for this moment all her life. Vaughn slammed his glass onto the table, the champagne spilling in a golden arc across the linen. "This is absurd," he shouted, his voice cracking. "She is nothing, just a waitress. You all saw her spill wine, you all saw her incompetence, and you dare to turn on me because of a child playing servant?" His voice grew shrill, each word betraying the desperation beneath his rage. But the more he shouted, the less power he held. His empire had been built on intimidation, and now, without fear to sustain it, his words dissolved into noise. Benjamin's hand rose slightly, silencing the room again. "Richard," he said quietly, "business is not war. Business is trust. And tonight you have lost it. Not because of spilled wine, but because you revealed yourself when you thought no one of consequence was watching." The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. Vaughn's face flushed, his chest heaving. He reached for the contract papers as if to cling to them physically, but a younger associate pulled them away, sliding them back across the table toward Benjamin. "We will need to review," the associate said firmly, his voice carrying the authority Vaughn once wielded. The unraveling was complete. Vaughn's allies withdrew one by one, their phones lighting their faces with headlines of collapsing stock values, public outrage, leaked footage. Vaughn's empire was hemorrhaging in real time, its wealth bleeding away not from competitors, but from truth. He staggered, his hands trembling, his eyes darting from one turned back to another. For the first time, he looked small. Amelia stepped forward then, her apron still tied around her waist, her hands bare of jewelry or title. She did not raise her voice. She simply met his eyes, steady and unflinching. "Leadership is earned, not taken," she said. Her words carried farther than any shout, reverberating through the hall until even the chandeliers seemed to hum with them. Vaughn tried to respond, but no one was listening. The hall had already shifted away from him, drawn to the calm strength in Amelia's posture, to the clarity of a truth that no arrogance could erase. Cameras flashed again, not at Vaughn, but at her. In the stillness that followed, she felt the weight of her mother's words settle around her like armor. Dignity was not optional. Respect was the real currency. And tonight, the exchange rate had changed forever. The ballroom emptied slowly, not with the triumphant hum Vaughn had expected, but with the quiet murmur of shifting loyalties. Investors filed out in clusters, their voices low, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones as the headlines rolled across every major outlet. Vaughn's name, once synonymous with ruthless success, now trailed words like scandal, abuse, and collapse. Amelia remained near the back, still in her uniform, her tray resting on the linen-covered table she had been assigned to all night. For the first time since the Bordeaux spilled across his jacket, she felt her lungs draw a full, unbroken breath. The air tasted different, lighter, though heavy with consequence. She knew this was not the end, but the beginning of something larger. Benjamin stood beside her, not with grand gestures or fanfare, but with the quiet steadiness of a man who had waited years to make a point at exactly the right time. His hand brushed her shoulder briefly, a silent acknowledgement that her restraint had carried more weight than any speech he could have given. "Let's go," he said softly. She nodded, slipping the tray aside. Together they walked out, past waiters who looked at her with something new in their eyes, past investors who whispered her name as if trying it out for the first time. Amelia Carter, no longer invisible. By morning, the world had moved into a frenzy. Financial news anchors dissected Vaughn's fall as though it were an autopsy, replaying the clip of his sneer and her calm response on endless loops. Hashtags bearing her name surged across platforms, some celebrating her composure, others speculating about her family connection, all agreeing on one thing: the empire of Richard Vaughn was unraveling. His company's stock plummeted, wiping billions off its value in hours. Former partners distanced themselves, issuing carefully worded statements. Reporters camped outside his offices, their microphones catching only silence from behind the glass doors. Amelia had not slept. She sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, a cup of coffee cooling beside her, Sarah's head resting on her shoulder. The younger girl had stayed awake with her, eyes wide with both pride and fear. "You didn't just stand up for yourself," Sarah whispered. "You stood up for everyone who never gets heard." Amelia kissed her sister's hair lightly, but she did not respond. The truth was still too large, the noise of the world outside too overwhelming. She wasn't sure what she had done, only that she had not broken. Calls began arriving before dawn. Some were from news outlets demanding interviews, others from strangers offering jobs, partnerships, platforms. One in particular came from a group of investors who had walked away from Vaughn's deal. They wanted to meet. Amelia hesitated, unsure if she was ready to step from the quiet resilience of survival into the harsh spotlight of leadership. But Benjamin's voice, calm over the line, reminded her, "You don't choose when history arrives. You only choose whether to stand when it does." Later that week, Amelia entered a glass tower not as a waitress, but as a guest of honor. Cameras followed her every step as she walked beside Benjamin into a boardroom lined with faces that had once bent toward Vaughn's will. Now they studied her with a different expression, cautious respect. A document lay on the polished table, not a billion-dollar merger, but something more human. It was a proposal to create an internal division dedicated to corporate ethics and human capital, a department with real power to hold leaders accountable. Benjamin gestured toward her. "This is Amelia Carter," he said. "She will lead it." The room was silent, not from disbelief, but from the gravity of the shift. Amelia looked around, her hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. She thought of her mother ironing before dawn, of Sarah's voice urging her not to shrink, of the countless nights she had endured being overlooked. All of it had brought her here, to this room, where power could be redirected. She did not give a grand speech. She simply said, "Leadership is earned, not taken. If we remember that, we can build something worth trusting." The words landed with quiet force, more powerful than any thunderous declaration. Heads nodded, pens moved. The proposal passed unanimously. Meanwhile, Vaughn's empire crumbled. Investigations opened, not just into his behavior at the gala, but into a decade of questionable deals, fraudulent clauses, silenced employees. Former allies testified against him to save themselves. The man who had once strutted across ballrooms now avoided cameras, his smile gone, his voice reduced to angry denials no one believed. Financial magazines ran split covers, his face, twisted in anger, beside Amelia's calm profile. The contrast told the story more clearly than any headline. But Amelia did not gloat. She refused interviews designed to sensationalize, declined offers that treated her as a token. Instead, she returned each night to her apartment, cooking dinner for Sarah, walking through the city streets with her blazer draped loosely over her shoulders. She remained grounded because dignity was not optional, and because victory was not about humiliating a man who had humiliated her. It was about transforming the silence of the overlooked into something permanent. In the months that followed, the division she led began to shape policy across industries. Other companies called, asking for guidance. Employees who had once feared retaliation now found pathways to speak. She mentored younger staff, reminding them that success was not measured by how loudly one demanded respect, but by how steadily one carried themselves through storms. Reporters began to call her an architect of a new American dream, one not defined by ruthless conquest, but by the power of discipline, motivation, and an unshakable respect for human worth. Vaughn, stripped of his positions, watched from the sidelines as the world moved on without him. Some said he planned to return. Others whispered he would disappear into obscurity, but his shadow no longer loomed over Amelia. His downfall was not her victory. Her victory was the quiet smile of Sarah, walking into school with pride. The employees who whispered, "Thank you," after board meetings, the investors who now measured leadership by integrity rather than intimidation. On a crisp autumn morning, Amelia stood outside the tower that now bore her name on a plaque. Director of Human Capital Ethics. She adjusted the collar of her blazer, Sarah's hand slipping into hers. Cameras still flashed, but she did not look at them. She looked ahead, down the street, into a future she had not planned but one she was ready to claim. She turned to Sarah and whispered, "Respect is the real currency. Never forget that." Her sister nodded, her eyes bright. Together they walked forward, leaving the past behind, carrying the weight of a new beginning. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. More underdog stories are coming your way.